Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to untangle two things that I think we all deal with on a pretty regular basis, stress and anxiety. And I think we often use these terms like they're interchangeable, but in this deep dive we're going to find out why that's not quite right.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into this. It's amazing how much confusion there is around these terms, but understanding the difference can actually be super empowering when it comes to managing those feelings.
That's what we're here for, to give you guys the knowledge to feel more in control. And we've got some really interesting sources today that go way beyond just those basic definitions. We're going to look at the actual biology. What's going on in our bodies and brains when we experience stress versus anxiety?
Yeah, and also what kinds of things trigger each one?
Exactly.
Right.
Because it's not always the same, is it?
Definitely not. And that's where those key differences start to emerge.
So let's dive in. Where should we start? What's the big picture here?
Well, maybe a good place to start is with that good old fight or flight response. That primal instinct that helped our ancestors survive in the wild.
Oh, yeah. Like when they encountered a saber-toothed tiger or something.
Exactly. It's hardwired into us, and it's still active today, even though we're not exactly dodging predators on a daily basis.
So how does this fight or flight thing relate to stress and anxiety?
Well, here's the thing. Both stress and anxiety are actually rooted in the same primal response.
Whoa, really? I wouldn't have guessed that.
It's true, it's just that they tap into it in different ways. Think of it like this: stress is your body's immediate reaction to a perceived threat.
Okay, so like right now I'm feeling a little stressed because I really want to do a good job explaining this to everyone listening.
Exactly.
All
That's
right.
your body going into that fight or flight mode, even though the threat is just wanting to perform well.
Wow, that makes so much sense.
Yeah,
So my heart might be beating a little faster, I might be more alert.
right. All thanks to that surge of hormones like adrenaline, and that's actually preparing you to either confront the challenge or run away from it.
Makes sense. So that's stress. But what about anxiety then? How does that fit into this fight or flight picture?
Anxiety is more like your body's reaction to being in that prolonged state of stress.
Okay, so it's like stress is the initial spark, and anxiety is what happens when that spark turns into a lingering fire.
Perfect analogy. And one of our sources points out that anxiety is often future oriented. It's that feeling of worry or unease about things that might happen.
Like that feeling you get before a big presentation or a job interview.
Exactly. You're anticipating a potential threat, even if it's not actually happening in that moment. And that can trigger all those same fight or flight responses: the racing heart, the sweaty palms, the difficulty concentrating.
Ugh, yes. I know those feelings all too well. So it sounds like stress and anxiety share a lot of the same symptoms.
They do, which is why it can be so tricky to tell them apart. Our sources actually list a whole bunch of these overlapping symptoms.
Okay, let's hear them. What are we talking about here?
Well, we've got the obvious ones like increased heart rate, rapid breathing, muscle tension, but then there are also things like digestive problems, irritability, difficulty sleeping, and even problems concentrating.
It's like a whole laundry list of unpleasantness. So if the symptoms are so similar, how are we supposed to know if we're dealing with stress or anxiety?
That's the million-dollar question. And it really comes down to a few key distinctions. First, as we talked about, stress is usually linked to a specific trigger.
Like that big presentation I was just talking about.
Right. And once that trigger is gone, the stress usually fades away too. Anxiety, on the other hand, can stick around even when there's no obvious cause. It's that feeling of unease that can be hard to shake.
So is that kind of free-floating worry that doesn't have a specific target?
Exactly. One of our sources uses the example of a deadline at work. That's a clear stressor. You feel stressed because of the deadline, but once the project is done, the stress subsides.
Gotcha. But with anxiety, it's like that worry just hangs around, even when there's nothing specific to be worried about.
Exactly. And to make things even more complicated, anxiety can actually become chronic, meaning it lasts for months or even years and starts to interfere with your daily life.
Wow, so it's not just about feeling a little anxious here and there.
Yeah,
It can actually become a really big problem.
it can. And that's why it's so important to understand these differences and know when to seek help.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this is such an important topic to unpack. So we've talked about how stress is that immediate response to a trigger, while anxiety is more of a lingering feeling. But what about the triggers themselves? Are those different too?
Absolutely. This is where things get really fascinating.
I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
Stress is usually triggered by something external.
Okay, so like events or situations that are happening around us.
Exactly. Our sources give some great examples. Things like job pressures, financial problems, relationship issues, major life changes. These are all classic external stressors.
Yeah, those definitely sound stressful. But what about anxiety? What triggers those feelings?
Well, while anxiety can sometimes be a response to external stressors, it can also stem from internal factors.
Wait, so you're saying our own thoughts and feelings can actually trigger anxiety?
You got it. And this is where things get really complex and interesting because it involves a whole interplay of things like genetics, brain chemistry, and even learned behaviors.
Wow, okay. I think we're going to need a whole separate deep dive to unpack all of that. But for now, I think we've laid some really important groundwork. We've learned that stress and anxiety, while often lumped together, are actually quite different beasts. Stress is that immediate fight-or-flight response to a specific trigger, while anxiety is more of a lingering, future-oriented worry. And both can be triggered by a whole range of things, both external and internal.
Exactly. And understanding these differences is crucial for figuring out how to manage those feelings effectively.
Which brings us to the next big question.
Hmm.
What can we actually do about it? Because I think we all want to know how to feel less stressed and anxious, right?
Absolutely. And the good news is there are a ton of strategies that can help.
Well, hold on to your hats, folks,
Yeah.
because in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore a whole toolkit of coping mechanisms for both stress and anxiety. Stay tuned. All right, so we're back and ready to tackle the big question. How do we actually deal with all this stress and anxiety? Now that we know they're not exactly the same thing, do we need totally different approaches for each?
You know, it's interesting. A lot of the strategies that work for stress can actually help with anxiety too.
Oh, really? So it's not like we need two separate toolboxes.
Not at all. Think of it more like having different compartments within the same toolbox. You might
Yeah.
reach for slightly different tools depending on the situation?
Okay, that makes sense. So what are some of the universal tools, so to speak? Where should we start?
One of the most fundamental and often overlooked strategies is simply taking care of your physical health. I know, you've probably heard it a million times.
Yeah. Eat your veggies, get some sleep, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But there's a reason why this advice is so common, and it's actually super relevant to managing both stress and anxiety. Our sources emphasize that physical well-being is crucial for mental well-being.
So it's not just about looking good, it's about feeling good too.
Exactly. When you're stressed or anxious, your body goes into that fight or flight mode, right?
Right, all those hormones pumping.
Exactly. Your heart rate goes up, your breathing changes, your muscles tense up. It's exhausting.
Mm.
But when you're taking care of yourself physically, eating well, exercising regularly, getting enough sleep, you're actually giving your body the resources it needs to better cope with those stress responses.
So it's like you're building up your resilience.
Exactly. And it can make a huge difference in how you experience those feelings.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But what about those times when you're feeling stressed or anxious in the moment? Like right now, I need something to help me calm down.
I hear you. That's where those relaxation techniques come in handy.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples.
Things like deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, or even just taking a few minutes to practice mindfulness.
Mindfulness. That sounds a bit no agey. Does that stuff really work?
You'd be surprised. It's not about incense and chanting. It's really just about focusing on the present moment. You know, paying attention to your breath, your senses, your surroundings, without judgment.
So you're basically shifting your focus away from all those worries and stresses.
Exactly. And that can really help to break those cycles of negative thinking and just bring you back to a place of calm.
I like it. So it's like a mental vacation from all the chaos.
Exactly. And it's something you can do anytime, anywhere. You don't need any special equipment or training.
Okay, those are some great tips. But
Yeah.
what about those deeper anxieties, the ones that seem to stick around even when we're doing all the right things? Like what if it's more than just everyday stress?
That's a really important point, and it brings us to the realm of what are called cognitive distortions.
Cognitive distortions. That sounds intense. What are those?
They're basically these patterns of thinking that are negative and unrealistic, but we often believe them anyway.
Okay, so like those thoughts that pop into your head and make you feel bad, but when you really look at them, they don't actually make sense.
Exactly. And our sources talk about how these cognitive distortions can really fuel anxiety.
So it's like our own thoughts are actually making the anxiety worse.
In many cases, yes. And that's where cognitive reframing comes in.
Cognitive reframing. Lay it on me. What is that?
It's basically a way of challenging those negative thoughts and replacing them with more balanced and realistic ones.
So like talking back to your inner critic.
Exactly. Let's say you're feeling anxious about an upcoming presentation, and you have this thought like, I'm going to mess this up and everyone's going to think I'm an idiot. Cognitive reframing would involve asking yourself, is that really true? What's the evidence for that?
And Chances are there isn't much evidence. You've probably given plenty of successful presentations before.
Right. So you might reframe that thought to something like, okay, I might feel a little nervous, but I've prepared well. And even if I stumble a bit, it's not the end of the world.
So it's about taking those negative thoughts and putting them through a reality check.
Exactly. And over time, as you practice this, you actually start to rewire your brain to think more positively.
Wow, that's powerful stuff. But I'm curious, what about those stressful situations that you can't really control? Like you can't just reframe your way out of a job loss or a family crisis, right?
You're absolutely right. In those situations, it's about focusing on the things you can control.
Okay, so like what? What kind of things?
Well, one really helpful strategy is problem solving. Instead of getting caught up in worry and feeling helpless,
Hmm.
you can take a step back and say, okay, what are the specific challenges I'm facing here? And what are some potential solutions?
So it's about taking action instead of just freaking out.
Exactly. And even if you can't completely change the situation, taking some kind of action can give you a sense of control and reduce that feeling of overwhelm.
I like that. So it's not about ignoring the problem, it's about finding ways to approach it constructively.
Exactly. And breaking down those big, overwhelming problems into smaller, more manageable steps.
So instead of thinking, oh my God, my whole life is falling apart, you can think, okay, what's one thing I can do today to start moving forward?
Exactly. And that can make a huge difference in how you feel.
Okay, those are some really great strategies. But what about when it feels like you're doing all the right things, but those feelings of stress and anxiety just won't go away? Is there ever a point where you need more than just self-help strategies?
That's a great question, and it leads us perfectly into the final part of our deep dive. Because while these coping mechanisms can be really effective, sometimes we need a little extra support.
So in other words, there's no shame in asking for help.
Absolutely not. In fact, it's often the bravest and most important step you can take.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of this deep dive, and things are about to get real. I think we need to talk about when those everyday stresses and worries maybe cross the line into something a little more serious.
I agree, because we've been talking a lot about those day-to-day struggles with stress and anxiety, but there's a whole other level to this where those feelings can become so intense or so frequent that they start to really impact your life. And that's where anxiety disorders come in.
Okay, so anxiety disorders, those are like anxiety, but worse. How do you know if what you're experiencing is normal anxiety or something that needs more attention?
That's such an important question. One of the biggest things to look for is how much that anxiety is actually interfering with your life. If it's starting to affect your work, your relationships, your ability to just enjoy things, that's a sign that maybe it's more than just everyday stress.
So it's not just about feeling anxious sometimes, it's about how much that anxiety is taking over.
Exactly. And our sources really emphasize that these disorders can manifest in a lot of different ways. So the specific symptoms can vary a lot from person to person.
Okay, so what are some of the common signs that someone might be dealing with an anxiety disorder? What should we be looking out for in ourselves or in loved ones?
Well, some of them are pretty similar to what we've already talked about. That constant worry, the racing heart, the trouble sleeping. But these symptoms are often much more intense and frequent. Like, imagine feeling that sense of impending doom almost all the time, or having panic attacks that come out of nowhere.
Oh, wow, that sounds really scary.
It can be. And there are also a lot of physical symptoms that can go along with anxiety disorders, like chronic fatigue, digestive issues, muscle tension, even chest pain. Sometimes people mistake those physical symptoms for something else entirely and don't even realize that anxiety might be the root cause.
So it's like our bodies are trying to tell us something's wrong, but we might not always recognize the signals.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that everyone experiences anxiety differently, so there's no one-size-fits-all checklist of symptoms.
That makes sense. So what should someone do if they're thinking, okay, maybe this is more than just everyday stress, maybe I need help?
First of all, know that you're not alone. Anxiety disorders are incredibly common, and there is absolutely no shame in seeking help. It's a sign of strength to acknowledge that you need support and to take steps to get better.
That's such an important message. So where should someone even start? Who should they talk to?
A good first step is often to talk to your primary care doctor. They can help rule out any other medical conditions and refer you to a mental health specialist if needed.
So it's like your doctor can be your guide in navigating all of this.
Exactly. They can also offer some initial advice and support. And there are tons of other resources available too, like online directories of therapists, support groups. even hotlines you can call if you're feeling overwhelmed.
So like a whole network of support just waiting to be tapped into.
That's exactly what it is. And with the right help and support, anxiety disorders are very treatable. There are therapies, medications, and lifestyle changes that can make a world of difference.
That's really reassuring to hear.
Mhm.
So to wrap things up, I think the big takeaway here is that knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about stress and anxiety, the better equipped we are to manage those feelings and get the help we need.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that taking care of your mental health is just as important as taking care of your physical health.
I love that. So to all our listeners out there, be kind to yourselves, prioritize your well-being, and don't be afraid to reach out for help if you need it. And until next time, happy diving.